My name is Louis Carr. I'm part of our HP software marketing. I'm part of the corporate organization. I do have a bit of background in security. I worked with some of the intelligence community on building systems for compartmentalization of information based on Trusted Solaris and some other things, DoD CAC cards, etc. So I've got a little bit of background in this space and volunteered to step in for Sean. As I said, we do software. This is the extent of our bit on the product side. As you can see, even there's no products. These are just some of the general areas that we actually work in. With respect to security, we've made 3 major acquisitions over the last 3 years to really place us in the security space. Fortify, which is really around application development, testing, deployment security. Obviously, you know that the vast majority of your security holes are actually in the application layer. We made a acquisition of a company that does security intelligence and risk management, which is the basis of some of the concepts I'm going to describe in this presentation today. That's ArcSight. And then we also have a network security company we acquired called Tipping Point, does intrusion detection and prevention. So the others I'll skip for the moment. I would say the big data stuff is worth mentioning because a lot of the impetus behind moving towards what the title of this presentation is, non-traditional means or applications of security, intelligence, and event management, or SIEM, is going to involve the need for big data. So the big data acquisitions we've made include autonomy, which is very useful for very complex search and query, particularly when you're doing those searches across unstructured data. We also made the acquisition of one of these columnar database companies. I don't know if columnar database, but not the traditional kind of row-based SQL databases, but ones that can still do SQL, but also non-SQL. A company called Vertica. So that's sort of a background of some of the components behind at least what is leading us to the position we're going to take in this presentation. I won't give you all the Sun Tzu background starting phrases. I'm sure you've heard them all. You know, if you know yourself and you know your enemy, if you know your enemy but you don't know yourself, blah blah blah. All of those things. Those are the typical things people say before. In fact, the matter is, it's just simple. You need to know what you're up against, right? Know your adversary. The problem is that what you may have seen as an adversary in the past is really changing. They're a lot smarter and a lot more organized than they were before. That's a given. We all know that. They do significant research. They have time to do that research. They have different ways of infiltrating. They have different groups that specialize in different types of infiltration. And then once they get in, depending upon which group they're in and what sort of method of infiltration they use, they go around and they collect different information. Sometimes they know what to do with that information. Sometimes they just have a hunch as what to do with it. But they have a community where if I don't know what to do with that information exactly, I know there must be some value. I'll actually put it out for bid on the market and get from other people what that actual value will be. So not only are they more complex, they're more sophisticated, they even have developed their own economy and business model. That's the level of sophistication these guys have gotten to. So once they figured out what might be of interest to whom, they then decide to do something with it, and then turn that into cache. Sometimes it's cache where directly it's cache, other times it's not cache necessarily for that adversary. It's a matter of inflicting pain and harm on you, so it's still cache to you. This is something I mentioned a moment ago. 84% of breaches occur at the application layer. 68% we see actually of an increase that has to do with mobility. And my question to all of you is, how many of you have allowed mobile devices as a way of accessing not just some information about static various things, but actually are allowing those mobile devices to connect up to applications that are handling transactions or attaching to citizen records or student records or something that involves private data and financial data? How many of you are allowing applications for that? A couple. Are you more concerned about the... Yes, absolutely. So many of you that aren't is part of the reason that you're reluctant or reticent to get into this area of allowing for that last mile to be mobile, simply because you're concerned about the security. So that's the most. So you buy these numbers. This is a real concern for you. Okay, good. How many of you fall into this category? That if you've had a breach, or I should say if you've had a breach, because if you haven't reported, somebody knows you, and there's a camera in the back of the room. Let me rephrase this question. How many of you are concerned that if you have a breach, it's most likely going to be identified and the notification of that breach will be provided by somebody external to your organization? Big issue. Big issue. With our customers under NDA, this is exactly what we find. So that number, almost invariably we find that that's the case. Now that's not all breaches. So I find it interesting that, you know, these could be very minor breaches. The big breaches could still be found by you if you have the right things. The problem is the time to actually go and resolve that breach is going up. More importantly, the time to find the breach is going up. The time to find the breach is the real issue, because as these adversaries become more complex in what they're doing, and it doesn't have to be that they are some arm of the Mossad or the US intelligence community. We're talking about, you can make, just like with any, unfortunately, with any government position, there's an analog position in the commercial world, black market or above board, that probably pays more than whatever you were making with the government, regardless of what it is. So as a result, the types of breaches that were occurred with, let's say, for example, the Natanz, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of the nuclear power plant in Iran, that so perhaps the United States and Israel got together and devised a very sophisticated attack that went across many different attack vectors and ultimately ended up in the essentially the industrial controller SCADA network that managed the nuclear power plant in Iran, right? So you went from multiple systems, with the first one being sneaker netted in, so forget about all your network security. If you can do multiple stage attacks like that, it's no wonder that you could see an average time of detection starting to creep up to 416 days. And this is assuming you actually knew what you were doing. There's one large federal department that had a false alarm recently over the last year that they spent over $316 million dealing with. A false alarm. It wasn't even a real, you know who they are, right? I'm always reluctant because a lot of these guys are our customers, and you know, we tell them do this or do that, and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. But so and we don't have rights to say who they are, even though it's You can go on Federal Computer Weekly, or you can go on any of these and you can see actually who they are. The point is, it's not just a matter of, it takes a long time to make the detection, it's taking a long time even to determine that sometimes your detection wasn't correct. And based on a certain incorrect analysis, it could cost you as much as if you had made the proper analysis. When a detection is made, whether it's that 94% that are coming from external versus you internally found out, either way, if it does get into the press, it becomes front page news, particularly if it means that you were, and here's a state level one. I point this out to this organization or group in here. How many of you are with various parts of the California state IT systems? One, two, most of you. How many of you are from some sort of education or healthcare? To education or education? Okay. So my healthcare example is probably going to be boring and I'll skip it. Nobody's from healthcare, okay. But I think this one's really important. How many of you are familiar with this example here with South Carolina? Okay, so.
Carl showed the film yesterday.
Okay, yeah, I'm, unfortunately, I wasn't here.
South Carolina. This is 4.9, and this is backup to. I think it's a different one.
Oh, no, no, it is the same one.
It is the same one?
What I've done is a bad job of mashing together several. And it shows how unreadable it is because you just attached the TRICARE one, which was a backup issue.
TRICARE is
exactly.
military healthcare system.
Correct, yeah, and that was, so some of these are where, you start with a phishing attack, as you found out yesterday. Some of these are just stupidity where somebody leaves the wrong thing in the wrong place. Some are operator error internal. There's so many different ways that you can end up with these. But what we're saying is this is still a relatively simple attack. This is simple-minded, I forgot something I would do, right? Some of these, like the one we were mentioning earlier with the Iranians, or the Iranians fighting back and doing something against a Saudi firm. These are much more sophisticated attacks. Unfortunately, that level of sophistication, which in many of your minds you may be relegating to or sectioning off as something that's only going to happen between nation states, could happen to you, right? It's the same thing as what happened here, just a different level of sophistication. The point or the effort being to make some cash off of you. The fact of the matter is that they are getting more sophisticated. That's just half of the challenge that you're facing. The other half of the challenge, which I'm sure you're hearing through other parts of this conference, is the fact that your IT platforms upon which you are running and worried about making your security defense on is getting more complex, right? So the fact that you're going into cloud environments where you don't have full control of the actual systems. We already talked about the mobile devices. We're going to talk a bit in a moment about the fact that it's not just a matter of these new platforms, it's a matter of where the security holes can be on these platforms, and that there are additional pieces to the platforms that you don't even normally think of as part of your compute platform. Right? The mobile device is a great example of that. Right? As it's an extension that you didn't have to deal with, it's an extension that's rapidly changing, the platforms on it are rapidly changing, the development environment for it is different, the mindset of the people developing is different, the result is a lot of security holes. And we've talked a bit about this, so I won't belabor the point, but clearly it's this whole area of advanced persistent threats is what I'm really getting at. To deal with the advanced persistent threats, the thing that you really need to be concerned with is some level of continuous monitoring. Some level of diagnostics along with the continuous monitoring or part of it. So how many of you are tracking and are interested in what is going on with the Department of Homeland Security's effort to put in place this, and it's, of course, it's only other federal organizations, but In doing that, they're building a lot of information that I believe you can leverage as well. But how many of you are familiar with what the Department of Homeland Security is doing around continuous diagnostics and monitoring? Okay. For those, I saw one hand. I highly urge you to go look at what DHS is doing. Just go to their website. One of the cool things they're doing is trying to establish some sort of model for categorizing, defining, and sharing threat analysis. And that's going to be really important, particularly as things are changing very rapidly. And you look at a threat and you're trying to determine, does this threat apply to me? If it applies to me, what priority should I assign it in trying to assess it or deal with it? Do I trust the information about this threat? In other words, not just the information itself, but who is providing me with that information, right? So all of this background around continuous monitoring is really required in order to standardize it in a way that you can share it, make decisions on it properly, all right? So anyway, the continuous monitoring is a key part of dealing with these advanced threats. The question is, what do I monitor? And if I'm monitoring one particular stream, is that sufficient? And the answer, that's a rhetorical question, no. You tend to have to monitor multiple streams of information. The question is, which streams do I think of? Well, I think of monitoring the network. I think of monitoring particular servers. I think of monitoring, particular storage. In other words, I think of monitoring the underlying IT systems. I don't necessarily think of monitoring the applications themselves. I don't necessarily think of monitoring, and even when I'm thinking of monitoring the applications, I'm thinking of monitoring the applications that are running directly on top of my enterprise systems from the server side, or with more complexity in the cloud. Monitoring the mobile device from a security perspective is a new thing. Imagine adding to that monitoring multiple devices that you didn't even think of before. And again, we're going to talk about that in a moment. The point is, I've got to think about monitoring all these streams, and I've got to think about correlating the information between them. And am I correlating just the information I'm getting at this present moment? Sure, but in and of itself, is that sufficient? No. Necessary, but not sufficient. I need to be concerned with monitoring and storing and having a historical pattern of what access and usage and the process of these particular streams looks like over some background set of time, right? So in the past, how long have you stored security data for? How many of you store for months? One hand. How many of you store for years? A couple of hands. How many of you? The point is, and so different levels. Point is, you're probably going to be storing a lot more information for a lot longer, and then running through that information to build up some historical profile so that you can do predictive analysis of what your future looks like. Predictive analysis of whether you might be seeing a problem, whether that problem is performance or whether that problem is actually a security problem. That's part of why you end up with false alarms like that particular federal department. They couldn't tell a performance problem from a security problem. The first step towards this continuous monitoring issue is to, oh, this is not the right version. I pulled the old version. That's brilliant. Okay. Because I didn't want to actually describe anything that was specific to us. Let me say, yes, we have one of these security operations centers, but our competitors have plenty of these as well. The point with these security operations centers is that they allow you to build up a best practice. They allow you to take your best skills, put them into one place. Typically, what you also want to do with one of the security operations centers is to put an adjunct of a program management office that's helping with the security policy and its implementation in the various departments around your larger organizations. How many of you have a security operations center? How many of you have within your security, so let's step back from that. How many of you have more than 10 people in your security organization? how many of you are lone wolves? Yeah, and that's a big issue. And so being able to have access to threat libraries, being able to set yourself up as your own program management office, trying to sort of deputize your folks that do the application development, do the application testing, do the actual monitoring, the continuous monitoring of their systems from a diagnostics perspective. Getting them to look at somewhat usage of the same tools. This is a very important issue when you are a lone wolf or in a small organization. So a lot of this it's like me going to, 2 weeks ago I was in a small country and doing some defense stuff, and I put up an example of the U.S. Department of Defense. And one of the folks I caught out of the corner of my eye, they're just rolling their eyes, because for them, this comparison, it's ridiculous, right? They've got some small budget versus the DoD. So, talking about something like HHS that has this huge set of resources around security might seem crazy, but I would still submit to you that much of what they do in terms of the policies and the use of the right tools can offset the fact that you have very little in the way of resources. The other thing, though, is hooking up to the right threat libraries, right? Because you're not going to be able to track and collect all the information internal yourselves. How many of you leverage threat libraries? Just a couple. I highly recommend you look into the threat libraries. Most of this is either small subscription fees, or if you're connected up to DHS, for free. Just something to consider. But again, it's what you're monitoring, what you consider to be the actual attack vectors that are going to come into your particular environment. And the fact of the matter is that generally we just look at the traditional things: OS, database, storage, networking, etc. We do not look at the applications. And you've got to start looking at developing an application log. If you use a log management tool, how many of you use a log management tool? Just a couple of you. The point that we're trying to make is that you should seriously consider, if you don't have one, obviously you need to get one. I don't care if it's ours. I'm not in sales either. I don't care if it's ours or someone else's, but you really need to consider getting some sort of log management tool. You're going to probably look at that log management tool from the standpoint of the traditional areas. What we're arguing is that you need to also add to that a tool that's going to allow you to look at how the application is being used. You can then do a correlation across these various things, including the application, to figure out where there is some level of misuse. So here's some examples of organizations, at least within the federal government, that have universal log management, and they're extending that log management to look at the way the application is being used with respect to the policies around that use, who's using the application, when they're using it, et cetera, and doing a correlation between that and the rest of their typical log management to determine if something's being used improperly. Why is this important? Let's say, for example, somebody that has access at a senior level in your organization resigns, right? So let's skip for a minute thinking about the external threats we talked about earlier, the typical adversary. And because actually, oftentimes, what you're gonna have to worry about is some combination of them. So you got somebody that's a little upset with the way things have worked out. Either they're leaving voluntarily as a result, or maybe they've been laid off or fired or whatever the case may be. And in your case, it doesn't have to be, like this slide, you can tell, I built this for more of the intelligence community, but there are still things that you want private in your organization. Let's say you're in education and you've got obviously not just the student IDs, but you have the social security numbers behind them and other information, date of birth, et cetera, So, this goes up on the black market to be sold for somebody to therefore go off and create a whole credit card skimming ring, right? So, trust me, that you might think, oh, this is not something I need to worry about. Nobody's going to steal cash from, my government institution. No, they're not. They're going to leverage you to steal cash from some of the citizens, and then you end up on the front page. They don't even necessarily have to be senior staff, as we're starting to see. More likely what they are is somebody in your IT organization. Again, why you need to deputize more of the folks in IT that go, I don't really care about security, because it allows you at least to set the right policies and also watch what they're doing as well. But you can see oftentimes it's not somebody at a high level that's doing this. The most notable one that we all think about is this guy that just got sentenced recently, at least for half of what he did. And that's why you get that combination, right? The insider and the external threat combining together. So if you can begin to look at the identity and access management as part of your log, your universal log management, it gives you some view into the potential for insider threats. So these are some of the areas where you'd want to look at doing log management of, and you don't, oh, maybe you do. So how many of you are doing this sort of security profiling of your users at the application level and pushing that into the same log management system? Or let's say for a minute you're not pushing the same log, but you're doing it separately. No one. One person there. So that's something that you really got to consider, particularly as these applications have a front end that's sitting on a mobile device where there's more opportunity to look for the security holes, all right? More opportunity to have them. And what you're going to do, again, is you're going to look at their profile of their usage over some historical period of time. That historical period of time and your profiling is going to look at which things they're using, when they're using them, how they're using them, and based on that, you're going, and their role, how high up in the organization they are, because yes, obviously, you could have a Bradley Manning at the bottom level, but you're more likely to have the problem with an Eric Snowden, right? He's at a different level and different access, right? So there's also going to be that use pattern coupled with the level that they're at. And basically what you're going to do is, back to that predictive analysis point, is assign some level of risk to the likelihood that they're going to do something, and then it's going to change how you watch them, the granularity of the data you're looking at to watch them, etc. So that sort of talks about dealing with the human element a little bit better in a much more complex system. The other part of the system that's more complex that you're going to need to deal with is the fact that there's much more intelligence out there running by itself, running off by itself, that you don't normally think of from a security perspective. And that side is much more of what we call this Internet of Things. So going forward, and I know at first this sounds, what? I don't need to worry about security for a bunch of, I don't know, parking meters, or I don't need to worry about the security of a bunch of medical devices, or whatever it happens to be. But the fact of the matter is, increasingly, you're going to need to be worried about the security of those things. I did have this healthcare example, but no one in here is in healthcare, right? So this example probably won't make any difference. Even if you're not, is anybody in here part of that manages an airport or anything like that? No. This one though, I think everyone can get. All right. So in other words, I have lots of luggage that I have to inspect. And if I'm going to inspect that luggage, let's say for example, I want to track to see how long it takes for luggage to get through. I obviously check with everyone before they bring their luggage in, and I say, did you check your bags? Were the bags out of your sight? Blah, 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 all these things. So we've got all these soft checks that are done. But nobody is going into the people that handle the baggage and asking these same questions of everybody running through all the baggage in the airport, right? What you do get though is is as you're running through these systems, particularly where there's RFID scanning or there's other more intelligent ways of monitoring the flow of that luggage, simply for efficiency reasons, not for security reasons, just monitoring the flow. You could tap into that flow and look at the pattern of how long it takes most luggage to go through. And based on that pattern, you'll have a profile of the speed at which it goes through and how long it takes to look at each bag, such that if all of a sudden a bag spikes and it took a lot longer to go through, that might be a security concern, right? You don't think of that as a normal piece of the process of security. Maybe at the same time as that's happening, most of the time, because you also, you know, we can accept that all of a sudden, possibly, something of value from a bag may disappear. Like, you know, my bag that's going into on the plane luggage is just too big, and so I have to take my Bose headphones and stick them in my luggage. I get to the other side, what happened to my Bose headphones, right? So you kind of get this idea of people stealing directly from that. You don't necessarily get the idea of people sticking things in, which takes a bit more time, right? So that's going to change that spike. I'd want to go back and look to see by camera if I can identify why that spike occurred. Is it somebody just taking out somebody's Bose headphones? Okay, we've got an HR problem, but we don't have a security problem. On the other hand, if they're sticking something in there that's going to make the plane go boom, well, that's a different story. So I might want to have the security cameras recording all the information, and immediately if I have a spike from that luggage, I want to also go back and look at the timestamps and the recording information from that very piece. So now all of a sudden I've taken this machine of things, and I've taken this set of, you know, unstructured data, the video feed, and I'm making correlation comparisons, right? I didn't know which examples to pick, so I decided to pick ones that just made sense to anybody and everybody, right? So this is an example where you're basically looking at some sort of physical threat using the same log management system that you were using to just do your traditional standard sorts of security around looking at your servers, your database, etc. Here's another one, very similar, but this is something I think any city can identify with. In fact, usually we're not supposed to, so I guess I shouldn't have this technically speaking in here of pulling clip art off the web. None of the other clip art in here, but I couldn't resist the other day, and I just stuck this here. How many, I'm sure many of you have gone shopping or at least at Christmas to see them light the big Christmas tree at Union Square. That's a San Francisco parking meter.
In Union Square?
I don't know if that one's in Union Square. I should have where I pulled it from. But it's somewhere in San Francisco in that congested area. And the reason I actually, one of the other companies I work with, worked a bit on collecting this particular story, so I know a lot of the background to it. But essentially, these are all smart meters. And one potential problem you can have with a smart meter, particularly one that reads a credit card. What are the problems you have with things that can read, especially in the United States where we don't have Java smart cards embedded in our credit cards? You go to an ATM machine, you stick in your card, you come back out. In that transaction, you might have taken out a little cash to pay for whatever. But guess what also happened oftentimes, particularly in certain countries like Brazil, they've taken out some of your money along with it, right? And they've also grabbed your PIN and they're continuing until the bank says no of trying to grab money. So, you know, this smart device becomes a security problem, right? Now, we talked about that insider threat of where you could go and grab that information from an insider, pulling it from your citizen registries, your healthcare registries, your student registries. That combined with being able to pull the information, put it onto a credit card, and just charge like crazy. Nobody's going to even track this little charge normally. But if you combine tracking this charge with other charges, it might help you to locate exactly who's done it. One reason is, in most cities, increasingly out in public areas, there are security cameras. So again, it's that combination of different things that you're correlating that gives you a better angle as to analysis of as to exactly who's done what. So, you know, that's kind of the background concept that I wanted to leave with you. If you have actual detailed questions on this from a technical perspective, I can provide you with a lot of the background technical details. We have white papers on this. We have also a lot of other things that describe this. Again, it's still at a level where it's not necessarily talking about you know, specific product features, because you really have to decide to get your head around this whole idea of using that same old log management system outside of its traditional areas. Some of that use will require additional features in that log management system. Some of that use does not. It's just a matter of integrating new points that are pulling in data. It may require sometimes you to also consider using different algorithms on top. But by and large, you're starting with that same system that was simply used to do what you did when you had a nice on-premise, fully controlled boundary around your systems. So any questions? We've got about 5, I'm showing 5 minutes, is that about right? We're supposed to finish at 11:45. It was till 11 to 11:45. Yeah, okay.
We have a SIEM tool. I'm not sure it's being implemented correctly, nor do I know whether the logs are being looked at. I'm not sure if we even have dashboard panels. Do you find that the state of those is it still too complex? Are we still in an infancy where we're not learning how to graphically represent data, or are we having problems with baselining? We've just put in place two big applications, and I have my IT folks who are saying, well, what kind of logging do you want us to do? And we keep trying to do that, explain that in very simple terms. Our policy is like 4 pages thick, and it basically collect everything, but the reality is that, you know, we can't, and we keep getting a lot of resistance as to, well, we really don't want to log it. You know, I mean, they don't tell me that, but they keep saying there's just too much data, and they're actually overwriting their own logs within a couple of hours because of the volume. They're getting the wrong kind of logs. They mean nothing, and it's just a pushback that we get, and I don't see a return on our investment. But I'm not sure if it's because they're hiding the complexity of setting up and using the tool. So, are we in an infancy with this type of a tool still, or are we? You know, why would I see, at least within our own organization, a lack of any return on our investment?
That was a short question. Hold
That's
on.
a Washington, D.C. kind of question.
Okay, so first, oh God, I hate to give you a Chris Christie answer to it, but you will grow up very quickly when you have your first real security breach. The fact of the matter is that a lot of organizations are still at that level, unless they are being forced. Like in the federal government, you're seeing much more of a push to get out of that baseline stage because of the policies and because you know, there's money flowing in to push people to do it. They have much larger budgets and organizations.
I can add.
Oh, no, go ahead.
We're getting ready to implement a log management tool ourselves, and we were going for the whole, SIEM as well. And after talking to some people that already implemented it, and even Gartner recommended that start with log management first, because SIEM is very complex. And we're looking at NIST. There's a NIST special publication on log management, and there's a lot of pre-configured alerts on your log management side that will, for certain activity that could be suspicious, that should be right out of the box.
Yep.
As well as learning it's kind of one of those things where you look in the firewall, you have to get used to your traffic, and then after a while, okay, this is normal. What's that? That's something new. As well as knowing the activities of your staff. For example, you might have admins that They always log on to these servers, and then one day you see them log on a different server, and you can configure a report for that, as well as maybe, hey, they're logging in at 2 a.m. in the morning, what's going on with that? Outside business hours. So some of it you have to kind of just configure yourself, some of it's out of the box. But it sounds like if they're, like challenge we had is the IT staff, they're too busy dealing with production issues. And so we work in the ISO office, and we're all about policy, but we realize, okay, there's a need here. So we're taking on that responsibility ourselves to look at the logs from a security perspective, and then so they can just focus on production issues and all that, 'cause that's what really drives them, and that's their priority, and our priority is security. So it might be that they just don't have the time. That's what we got pushed back too. So we're just taking it on ourselves. We got the security hats on, and we're looking for that weird traffic and thinking, so I think, some of that stuff. But NIST was, that NIST publication, I don't remember when it was.
Is it 137? I forget the
Yeah,
number.
something like that. It has log
Does anybody
management. That
remember?
kind of helps. I would do that. And if you have Gartner as a resource, reach out to them and they can help. But like I said, the tool itself probably has some default alerts already built in, I would hope.
Ours does, most of our competitors
We're
do.
looking at ArcSight.
You're looking at, yeah, that's
So
ours.
we'll-
So that has it. The other thing that it has is, you're talking about, you've got all these different feeds that you could log, and you also want to make sure not just that the alerts are out of the box, but that the connections are out of the box as well. I mean, that's another issue. And again, most companies have most of them out of the box.
Right.
So that is the first step. It sounds to me though like your organization may have a wee bit more in the way of resources from a security perspective than is. I would also think that even though you are going off and doing it yourself, there's still certain things that your ops folks are doing or that you'll need from them.
Oh yeah,
Right.
it's a partnership, it's a
Yeah.
collaboration between the two. And the log management tool can also pull information for performance issue and troubleshooting that's not security related. So it's a win-win.
Security related in one sense, that
Well,
you
yeah, it
never
could
know
be,
which one is, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a challenge, and you got to have, might be training. Some of the tools are not very intuitive. If you don't get the proper training, that could be another thing. So hey, I've had tools like that. It's like, it's just so frustrating. I give up.
Yeah.
So it could be a combination thing, but I think it's a good investment. It's all about the implementation and the strategy, and the plan, and all that, and the resources to implement it. But I don't think it's a waste of money. Maybe the tool you bought might get a different tool, but gotta do it.
Yeah. Most of the tools out there from us and our competitors are pretty good. It is, I think, really a function of training and the plan that you've set up and your relationship with the ops people.
Yes.
Any other questions that I can have somebody else in the audience answer far better than I could have thought of? We do have time for a couple more. There's one white paper I've taken more time to write that goes into a lot of detail to what the gentleman was just speaking about. I highly recommend if you haven't looked at that. It also lists a lot of the publications and the links to get to them, which is useful since I can't remember one from the next because I look at so many of them. So again, any other questions? That's my email address if you would like any of the information we have. I would also recommend that you go out and take a look at our tabletop. We have a tabletop out there. And that's it. I thank you so much for your time.